Thank you very much, and good evening. I feel like I'm very high above you all here. This is my first time in Portland, actually my first time in Oregon, so am I pronouncing that correctly? I was warned not to mispronounce it. So it's really a double pleasure for me, and I'd like to thank those who made this event possible, and I know it takes a lot of effort to organize events like this, so it means a lot to me. This is day 6, I think, of a 10-day tour I'm on that has taken me already to San Francisco, to Calgary, to Edmonton, to Vancouver, to Victoria, and I'll be continuing to Eugene earlier today. So this is my second time speaking today, and I'll be going on to Spokane and Olympia and Seattle. And what has struck me is that in all these places there's enormous renewed interest in this issue, and I tend to notice these things because I speak a lot, that the crowds are getting bigger again, that the opposition is getting a little bit stronger and more prominent. And I think this tells of the moment that we're in. Back in November 2008, when just after President Obama had been elected, there was a great deal of euphoria among people who care about the situation in Palestine, who thought that his election heralded the possibility of great change in the situation in Palestine in particular, but in U.S. foreign policy more generally. And at the time, though, I wasn't one of those who shared that sense of euphoria and optimism, even in a muted way. And what I wrote at the time was that President-elect Barack Obama's election victory has revived hopes that stalled Palestinian-Israeli peace negotiations could finally lead to a two-state solution. Few new presidents have been greeted with such optimism and associated high expectations. However, the chances for progress depend on more than a new American president. There are several interrelated factors: U.S. engagement, the availability of a viable peace agreement, Israeli and Palestinian internal politics, and the broader international situation. An examination of these factors indicates that the optimism is unjustified and that President Obama will not be more successful in bringing about a two-state solution to the conflict. This does not, however, mean that the situation will remain static or that those pursuing a just peace have no recourse for action. And in this particular article, I went on to explain a couple of things that I'll only summarize, but which I think are relevant for this evening's discussion. One is that when we talk about U.S. engagement, on the whole, people mean, has the United States appointed an envoy? And is that envoy toing and froing between various capitals? And is whoever happens to be Secretary of State making statements about how seriously the U.S. takes this issue? But what I argued is that we really have to look at the full range of U.S. engagement that is usually not talked about. Aaron David Miller, a former top State Department official, succinctly summed up the American role in Arab-Israeli diplomacy over the past 30-odd years in a Washington Post op-ed in 2005. As Israel's attorney, catering and coordinating with the Israelis at the expense of successful peace negotiations. And I'd argue that the United States is still acting as Israel's attorney. Now increasingly a criminal defense attorney in the face of mounting evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The Bush administration really took American engagement to new levels. There were, of course, things like the long-forgotten Annapolis Conference, when 67 odd countries were invited to Annapolis, Maryland, in, I think, 2007. I can't remember exactly. So 67 governments were invited, except for the one that Palestinians had, at that point, recently elected in the occupied territories. But what was more important, I think, was the Bush administration's direct intervention in Palestinian internal politics. First, the Bush administration pushed for elections in the occupied territories, and then when Hamas won them, attempted to overthrow the result by sponsoring a coup. And this was really well documented in a number of places, but one article in particular that I would refer to you, by David Rose in the April 2008 issue of Vanity Fair, called The Gaza Bombshell, which really laid out this sort of Contra-like intervention to try to overthrow Hamas. The administration helped arm and train Palestinian militias, again similar to the Contras, whose goal was to overthrow Hamas. It vetoed the Palestinian National Unity Government. And, crucially, it supported the blockade of Gaza that began as soon as Hamas was elected and was tightened in June 2007 when Hamas countered the American-sponsored coup, and which has been maintained since the Israeli bombing of Gaza just over a year ago. So this U.S. engagement is often not talked about, but it's been terribly destructive. You have to also count other forms of U.S. engagement, the billions of dollars a year in military aid that is sent to Israel, the lethal weapons, the close intelligence and military and other forms of cooperation that sustain and fuel the conflict, are in fact an intervention on one side. What I wrote back in November 2008 was that for the Obama administration to live up to the expectations and break with its predecessors would require that the U.S. make financial and other aid to Israel conditional on compliance with international law and signed agreements, such as long-ignored UN resolutions requiring Israel to cease building settlements and, in fact, to dismantle settlements, to stop interfering in Palestinian internal affairs and respect the democratic choices of the Palestinian people, and call for an immediate end to the blockade of the Gaza Strip. It would also require that the United States exercise its influence to level the power imbalance in negotiations rather than weighing the scales even further toward the stronger side. This includes using consistent standards for judging violent acts, negotiating ceasefires, and apportioning responsibility for breaches of ceasefires by Israelis and Palestinians. Now, with the perspective of more than a year of the Obama administration, I think we can safely assess the scorecard. You'll recall that the Obama administration made a demand, just as I had advised, although I have no illusion that they know I exist, let alone listen to what I might say, but demanding that Israel halt the construction of settlements in the parts of Palestine Israel occupied in 1967. And we saw how quickly, in the face of Israeli intransigence and the mobilization of the Israel lobby, the Obama administration completely dropped this demand in a really humiliating and quite blatant way. The Obama administration did not stop interfering in Palestinian internal affairs and has shown no signs of respecting the democratic choices of the Palestinian people. On the contrary, the Obama administration escalated the program led by Lieutenant General Keith Dayton to train Palestinian militias loyal to the US-backed Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas, and urge them to go out and hunt down and kill and arrest members of Hamas. They've shut down hundreds of civil society organizations in the West Bank. In other words, to sponsor a low-level Palestinian civil war and to block intra-Palestinian reconciliation. And finally, we've seen no word whatsoever from the Obama administration to commit to pressuring Israel to lift the siege and blockade of Gaza. In fact, not one word of criticism has emanated from this White House about the atrocities committed in Gaza. And the blockade continues really not just with the acquiescence of the Obama administration, but with its full support. I also went to Cairo for the Gaza Freedom March. And when Egypt decided to block us from proceeding to Gaza, more than 1,400 people from over 40 countries, our buses were prevented from going. They allowed a small token delegation to go, but the vast majority of us were not allowed to go to Gaza. We went, several dozen of us, several dozen Americans. This was, of course, a multinational group. But we went to visit the United States Embassy to ask our government to assist us. We wanted to tell them that it was in Cairo in June that President Obama had come to announce his new beginning with the Muslim world. And it was from a podium in Cairo that he had lauded the nonviolent tactics of the civil rights movement as examples for Palestinians and others to follow. So we wanted to go and tell the United States Embassy that we had come to Cairo in that spirit, and that we wanted them to assist us to go to Gaza, where the people were waiting for us so that we could walk with them, next to them, in solidarity, commemorating 1 year since the Israeli massacres. We were in fact detained outside the Israeli embassy for about 6 hours. About 30 of us were in one enclosure, completely surrounded by Egyptian riot police and intelligence and metal barricades, and another group of 7 in a similar situation a few dozen yards away. These enclosures came to be called the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And we were held there with the full knowledge and acquiescence of the US Embassy. Our right to visit our embassy was denied until finally 3 of us were allowed in. I was one of the 3. And we went on condition that nobody there, we weren't going instead of the others, we were simply going as the first group, and our demand was that anyone who wanted to visit the embassy be allowed to do so. We spent about an hour having a discussion with the chief political officer in the embassy, and we talked a lot about what was going on in Gaza. And they told us, well, we don't want you to go because we're afraid for your safety. We said, well, we understand the risk in going to Gaza, and we appreciate your concern, but we understand that the greatest danger to human life in Gaza is from weapons supplied to Israel by the United States. And we also recognize that, as you've said, they told us, don't you know Americans have been killed in Gaza? We said, yes, we're aware that Rachel Corrie died in Gaza. And if we had heard the United States government hold Israel accountable for Rachel Corrie's death, as well as the deaths of thousands of innocent Palestinians, we would perhaps be more impressed by your concern. But what we learned there was that not only was the US government going to do nothing to facilitate our passage to Gaza, more importantly, they were actually actively aiding the tightening of the siege and blockade. That the US Army Corps of Engineers, instead of rebuilding the levees in New Orleans, is helping Egypt to build, in fact, really directing and supervising Egypt to build an underground barrier that is designed to prevent people in Gaza digging tunnels, which have become their only lifeline for many basic necessities. So this is the complicity of the United States, which continues entirely unchanged from the previous administration. One of the things, I don't want to spend too much time looking backwards, but I think it's important to really look at these issues with a lot of clarity and precision. Because I think one of the myths that circulated was, well, we don't know what Obama's policy is. We have to wait and see. There's give him a chance. When in fact, he had been very clear through the previous years of the campaign. And I made a list of the policy, the positions he'd taken, and these are all direct quotes from speeches he'd made, so they're not inferences, but some examples that are significant. He supported the Israeli bombing of Lebanon in July and August of 2006, and repeatedly in the Gaza Strip as exercises of Israel's right to legitimate self-defense. He opposed the holding of the Palestinian elections, which included Hamas in January 2006. He opposed the February 2007 Mecca Agreement, in which Fatah and Hamas and other Palestinian factions agreed to establish a national unity government and to peacefully resolve internal Palestinian differences. He supports the continued isolation of Hamas. This is all prior to the election. He stated, "I will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself in the United Nations and around the world," again indicating the continuation of the US veto. He promised at least $30 billion of military aid to Israel over the next decade and pledged to push for Israel to gain access to armaments reserved for normally for NATO members. Pledged, the US should never seek to dictate what is best for the Israelis and their security interests. Stated, Jerusalem will remain the capital of Israel and it must remain undivided. Explicitly opposed the Palestinian refugees' right of return, and the quote from him was, "The right of return is something that is not an option in a literal sense." I'll say more about that later. And the list went on. What I concluded back in November was that there would in fact be no progress whatsoever towards a two-state solution, although we would see all sorts of kabuki about negotiations and envoys going to and fro. And in fact, we see that starting up again with George Mitchell starting so-called indirect talks. But what I did say is, and I think this is what brings us to the point we are now, is that while we can expect little change in US policy just because a new administration takes office, this does not mean that US policy will never change. The previous administration had to adapt its strategy to regional shifts of power, to resistance on the ground and other developments beyond its control. And some of the factors that I think will continue, again, regardless of what the United States administration does. And I suggested the following. There have been 2 Palestinian intifadas, uprisings, against Israeli occupation in the past 20 years, and there are warnings of a third. Israel will find it increasingly difficult to justify its policies to global public opinion and will face a growing challenge from the international Boycott-Divestment-Sanctions movement. Efforts to pursue Israelis accused of war crimes in the occupied territories through universal jurisdiction will intensify and may begin to bear fruit. Palestinians in Gaza will refuse to remain besieged. Palestinian citizens of Israel will continue to their own struggle for democracy. And finally, I noted that with open discussion so constrained in official circles, the discourse is confined to this very stifling peace process industry discourse which focuses only what men in suits do, and occasionally women in pantsuits, but usually men in suits, and ignores everything else that's happening. That as this official discourse continues to really become more and more separated from reality, this is also a moment when the growing number of academic and civil society conferences, debates, and activities aimed at exploring alternatives to the two-state solution can begin to decisively shape visions of a just, achievable, and peaceful future for all the people of the region. So that was my analysis in November 2008, and what I'm saying is I was right, so you should listen to me now. Well, I think a moment that many of us saw coming, some of us resisted and others embraced, has now arrived. And that's the moment when people understand that the so-called two-state solution is really the two-state problem. That what was at the root of conflict in Palestine was indeed the very effort to create a separate entity for a colonizing people and to partition the country, that the conflict as it exists today is the result of the violent partition of Palestine and the attempt to cleanse it of its original people so that there could be a so-called Jewish state on a land which for centuries had had an overwhelming Arab majority of Muslims, Christians, and indeed indigenous Palestinian Jews, who, though few in number, had a long presence and roots in the land. So now we see I would say the collapse of this consensus. When I travel around college campuses, I find that the young generation are enthusiastic about a single state. They see in it a vision that chimes with their universalist values, with the sense of justice, that this provides justice for Palestinians, equality, and it provides Israeli Jews with the possibility to, for the first time, actually be accepted, but by exchanging their status as settlers and a privileged caste for status as citizens, and an acceptance in exchange for making restitution, for decolonization, and bringing justice. But I still face quite a lot of opposition to this idea. Some people will sometimes say that what's the point of talking about a one-state solution when the vast majority of Israeli Jews are absolutely against it? And Israeli President Shimon Peres said in November, anyone who rejects the two-state solution won't bring a one-state solution. They will instead bring about one war, not one state, a bloody war with no end. And there are many other people who sometimes echo that view. And indeed, across the political spectrum, Israeli Jews insist on maintaining a separate Jewish majority state. But given the collapse of any viable alternative, I think we have to look at alternatives and consider how feasible they are. And I've argued, and certainly not uniquely, this is something that is seen increasingly. And in fact, I explored this. I borrowed a copy of my book to show you because I was very pleased to learn that there was a sudden surge in demand for it. It hadn't been a runaway bestseller. It was doing okay. But as we were planning this tour and we contacted the publisher, they told us it's out of stock. And we're reprinting it. But unfortunately, the reprints won't be ready in time. So I borrowed this copy just to show you. But it should be back in the stores any day now, or it's available from Amazon. But in the book, I won't go into all that now, but I explore the analogy with South Africa that I'll talk about from a different perspective this evening. Another example that I think is particularly important and has to be studied carefully and understood is what has happened in Northern Ireland, where there has been a very similarly structured conflict which resulted from the settlement in the 17th century of the northern part of Ireland by English and Scottish settlers who were predominantly Protestant, and the violent displacement of the indigenous people who were predominantly Catholic. And this established a settler-native dynamic very similar to Palestine. And when Ireland was partitioned in 1921, it created what Protestants in the north called, it was called Northern Ireland officially, but it was what they called unofficially a Protestant state for a Protestant people. And this meant that the native Catholic people living there were second-class citizens. They were living under a sort of apartheid state. And the peace agreement in Northern Ireland, which came after a good 300 years of this, a much older and deeper conflict, you could say, than the relatively young century-old one in Palestine, maintained the partition of Ireland. I mean, you could say that Ireland today is a two-state solution. It's a very different one from what has ever been contemplated in Palestine. You have the Republic of Ireland in the south, but in the north you no longer have a Protestant state for a Protestant people. You have a binational state of all its citizens. And you have a formal power-sharing administration which guarantees that all communities exercise power and that there is no more Protestant state for a Protestant people. And it establishes the principle of consent as being fundamental. And this is something that we're all taught in civics class, that a government can only be legitimate if it has the consent of the people who live under it. So if one day 51% of the people in Northern Ireland vote to change its status, to abolish it and join a united Ireland, then the governments are obligated to make that happen. But in the meantime, you have a remarkable example of a power-sharing administration, which I was in Ireland. I spent about a year and a half there at around the time the power-sharing administration came into being. And until it happened, this was in about 2007, nobody believed it would happen, that you'd have the nationalist Sinn Féin in a power-sharing administration with the unionist DUP of Ian Paisley. And it's, in a sense, very much like trying to imagine a a power-sharing government of Hamas and Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party. I mean, that raises a chuckle, but that's how unlikely what happened in Northern Ireland was in that context. And certainly it hasn't been easy. But there in South Africa you have an example of a unitary state with one person, one vote, and in Northern Ireland an example of a binational state with a sort of a formal power sharing. And both of these were viable, workable solutions to conflicts that were based in colonial settlement and expulsion, domination, and disenfranchisement of a native people, very similar to Palestine. But again, we have this conundrum that Israeli Jews, by margins of 90%, absolutely refuse to contemplate giving up a Jewish state. So, faced with this observation, I decided to go back and do some research into what South African whites, and I hope I'm not insulting you when I say that unlike some of the college audiences I've spoken to, I think most people in the room remember the South African struggle quite well, as I do. So I don't need to go into as much of the... I forget with the college students that that was happening before they were born, and so it's actually quite a luxury to assume a certain level of knowledge. In 1994, as we know, white minority rule in South Africa came to a peaceful end, a negotiated end, and it was replaced, after a transitional period of power sharing, with a unitary democratic state, with a one-person, one-vote system. But before this happened, how likely was this outcome? Was there any significant constituency of whites prepared to contemplate it? And what if the African National Congress, the ANC, had only put forward political solutions that whites told pollsters they would accept? Well, when you actually look at the evidence from the time, until very close to the end of the apartheid regime, the vast majority of whites in South Africa, including many liberal critics of apartheid, rejected a one-person, one-vote system. And they predicted that any attempt to impose one would lead to a bloodbath. Very similar predictions to those that Shimon Peres made about a one-state solution in Palestine. As late as 1989, F.W. de Klerk, of course the last apartheid president, said a one-person, one-vote system would be the death knell for South Africa. And we can understand that white fears were motivated from both some reasonable and unreasonable concerns. A study in 1988 that was published in the Journal of Modern African Studies found that South African whites, by an overwhelming majority, feared that a loss of white rule and a transition to majority rule would not just mean a loss of political power and socio-economic status, but it generated physical dread and fear of violence, total collapse, expulsion, and flight, the destruction of their society. And they could look to the example of the forced departure of almost 1 million white settlers in Algeria, 300,000 from Angola, and tens of thousands from Mozambique, as examples of what might happen to them, but on a much bigger and more catastrophic scale. So there was partly the reasonable fear of losing everything they knew. There was also a racial demonology. which relied on the notion that Africans were inherently less civilized, more prone to violence, were incapable of democracy, and you heard arguments that were something like this, show us another democracy in Africa. The moment we give up power, South Africa will become another black dictatorship like all the others. And of course we hear Israelis make precisely the same claim about Arabs and Muslims. So the racial or culturalist element is very important to recognize a name for what it is. Even as whites understood, as the 1980s progressed, that apartheid couldn't last, they still resisted a one-person, one-vote system and hoped that there could be some kind of alternative. Of course, you'll remember the Bantustans, the attempt to create these sort of pseudo-independent black states that are quite similar to the Palestinian Authority, although I think that they had more independence than the Palestinian Authority. And just to give you some examples, there's a few, but I will just go over two that were striking. In 1990, the year that Nelson Mandela was released from prison, a nationwide survey of Afrikaner whites found that just 2.2% were willing to accept a universal franchise with majority rule. Another survey from around the same time, 1988, of more than 400 white politicians, business leaders, clergy, media personalities, civil servants, and academics, in other words, the white elites, found that just 4.8% were prepared to accept a unitary state with a universal voting franchise. So you see that neither at the grassroots level nor at the top did whites appear close to embracing democracy and giving up their power. And there were also large majorities that considered a one-person, one-vote system to be unacceptable. And in fact, you also had, as you may remember, the white electorate in South Africa moving to the right at the time, just as we see the Israeli Jewish electorate lurching very rapidly towards the almost fascist right, parties such as those of Avigdor Lieberman. So in short, the vast majority of whites were simply unable to contemplate giving up power, even though they understood that their backs were against the wall. The ANC, however, knowing all this, insisted on a one-person, one-vote system with no white veto. And as the protests against the system grew, the strikes, the township uprisings, the international pressure, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, The Economist magazine observed in 1986 that many, quote, enlightened whites still fondly argue that a dramatic improvement in the quality of black life may take the revolutionary sting out of the black townships and persuade responsible blacks, that's in quotes, led by the emergent black middle class to accept some power-sharing formula. And this really strikes me as exactly like the Obama administration-sponsored and Netanyahu-sponsored economic peace in the West Bank. The idea that if you put in enough funding and have enough glitzy projects and have an ex-World Bank official and name him the Palestinian Prime Minister, that you can simply co-opt the Palestinian movement and take the sting out of the demand for an end to the colonization. And indeed, the ANC had a lot of advice from its friends abroad that it should be realistic, that it should understand that whites will never give up power, and trying to force them to do so would force them into the lager, they would circle the wagons, and they would prefer collective suicide to giving up. Very much, again, what we hear about Israeli Jews. Even Helen Suzman, who died recently, was one of the apartheid regime's consistent critics, said in 1987, this is what she predicted: the Zimbabwe conflict took 15 years and cost 20,000 lives, and I can assure you that the South African transfer of power will take a good deal more than that, both in time and, I'm afraid, lives. And, of course, it was just a few years later that the regime ended without the predicted. There was bloodshed, but not on the scale that was predicted, thankfully. And I think, again, The Economist was quite astute. And it predicted that the view that whites would prefer collective suicide was really a caricature. The vast majority of Afrikaners, it said, were no longer Bible-thumping Boers, Boers being the Afrikaner word for farmers that they adopted for themselves. They were, it said, part of a spoiled, affluent suburban society whose economic pain threshold may prove to be rather low. And it concluded that if whites would not give up the apartheid system voluntarily, then it was perfectly reasonable for the anti-apartheid movement to bring them the rest of the way through what it termed coercion in the form of sanctions and other types of pressure. The quicker the white tribe submits, The Economist said, the better its chance of a bearable future in a black-ruled South Africa. Now, with hindsight, we know that the combination of internal resistance and international isolation did force whites to abandon political apartheid and accept majority rule. But it's important to note that the combined strength of the anti-apartheid movement never really threatened the physical integrity of the apartheid state. Again, going back to The Economist, at the height of the township uprisings in the states of emergency in 1985 and 86, it said, "So far there is no real physical threat to white power. So far there is little threat to white lives. The white state is mighty and well equipped. It has the capacity to repress the township revolts far more bloodily. The blacks have virtually no urban or rural guerrilla capacity, practically no guns, few safe havens within South Africa or without." And I should note, just as a footnote there, that those weapons were largely provided by Israel in violation of the international arms embargo. The entire South African Navy and Air Force were outfitted by Israel, and even the riot equipment used against blacks in the township was manufactured by a company in Kibbutz Beit Alpha in northern Israel near the Lebanon border. So this balance of power never changed, and you could write a similar equation today about the power of a massively armed and rather ruthless Israeli state whose capacity for violence was demonstrated most recently in Lebanon and in Gaza, and much more lightly armed Palestinian resistance that really have no prospect in the near or far future of equaling Israel on the battlefield. What did change, however, and what all this military might, including nuclear weapons, were unable to prevent was the complete loss of legitimacy of the apartheid regime. Once any legitimacy was gone, whites lost the will to maintain a system that relied on increasing levels of violence and repression to maintain control, and which rendered them international pariahs. So as the cost of the status quo rose to unbearable levels because of the internal resistance and the external solidarity, they decided to make what they called a quantum leap and negotiate a peaceful way out of the dead end that apartheid had brought them to. And it all happened much more quickly, as I noted, and with considerably less violence than had been predicted. This moment, I think, is significant because it's a moment when more and more Israelis are recognizing that Zionism is suffering a similar terminal loss of legitimacy in the international community as a result of Israel's actions. Israel has always tried to present itself, particularly to the American public, as a liberal Jewish and democratic state, which is like us. But what more and more people are seeing is the reality of Israel as a militarized. I'm sorry, I've been talking so much the past few days that I'm losing the ability to make my tongue do what it's supposed to. More people are waking up to the reality of Israel as a militarized, ultra-nationalist, sectarian state that relies not on the consent of the governed, because Israel does govern all the Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza Strip and within Israel itself, but on escalating and frequent massacres to try to control them. Just a few days ago in Haaretz, they had a story boasting about the IDF's new heroes. These are 18 and 19-year-old young Israeli women who sit in front of video screens and direct remote-controlled machine guns at the Gaza Strip. So these horrifying technologies are what Israel is relying on in order to maintain control, to keep the unwanted humans, the people who are from the wrong ethnic group, in the prison that is the Gaza Strip, and to prevent them from being able to return to their homes in what is now Israel. This loss of legitimacy, Israel has tried to disguise it with propaganda, with trying to tell a narrative of a liberal state that is yearning for peace, when in fact there is a reality of more and less extreme forms of apartheid between Gaza and the Galilee. And it becomes more and more difficult to disguise as the demographic balance shifts once more in favor of the Palestinians. The Palestinians are becoming, in 2010, an absolute majority in historic Palestine, just as they were prior to 1948. And recently you may have heard that Ehud Barak, the Israeli defense minister, speaking at a conference in Israel, said that a failure to make peace with the Palestinians, don't be fooled by the peace language from Barak, I'll go into that later if you want to, but a failure to get some sort of political settlement that legitimizes Israel would leave either a state with no Jewish majority or an apartheid regime. In other words, what we already have now, I would argue, is a Jewish minority regime ruling over a disenfranchised Palestinian majority. At this point, a very tiny majority, but the trend is very clear. That's not even counting the refugees outside the country, of course. The threat is taken very seriously by Israel, and just a few weeks ago, one of the most influential think tanks in Israel, called the Reut Institute, made a presentation to the Israeli cabinet of a report which warned that Israel's traditional strategic doctrine, that where it viewed the principal threats to its existence as military, was out of date. That the main threat Israel faced was not on the battlefield. The main threat was the threat of what they called delegitimization. So exactly what happened to apartheid South Africa. And the report warned that a global delegitimization network, it's rather paranoid language, but nevertheless I think indicative of the mindset, that a global delegitimization network sought to bring about the implosion of Israel, much as what happened to the apartheid regime or to East Germany or the Soviet Union. And that, rather than military defeat on the battlefield, was the greatest threat to Israel. This so-called delegitimization network is made up of the broad movement of peace and justice, human rights, and BDS activists all over the world. BDS is short for Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions. And its manifestations include things like Israeli Apartheid Week, which is this week, and which students at colleges all over the world are marking with events like this one and like the one we had at the University of Oregon earlier today. The use of the legal systems of various countries to try to bring Israeli war crime suspects to justice, the Reut Institute characterized as lawfare, a really bizarre word, where if you resort to the law, you're waging a kind of war on, an illegitimate war on Israel. Normally we view resort to the law as a good thing. Israel views it as a bad thing in this context. And you may know that just a few months ago, for the first time in history, an arrest warrant was issued for an Israeli leader by a magistrate judge in London for Tzipi Livni, who was the foreign minister and one of the architects of the attack on Gaza. She was not arrested. She cancelled her trip to the UK just in time. But this was very significant and I think life-saving, a life-saving act by this judge, because for the first time in history, now Israeli leaders know that they have to take their personal fate into account when they launch the orders to commit potential war crimes. And just a few days ago, Ayub Ganic, a former vice president of Bosnia, was arrested on arrival in London on an arrest warrant issued by Serbia, and for crimes allegedly committed in 1992 and 93. So this is an example that shows that there is no statute of limitations, that these allegations and crimes will haunt Israeli leaders for however long it takes, and that Palestinians are using legal systems with increasing determination. And they know it, and they can now no longer travel abroad with the confidence that they will not be arrested. But here is, I think, the crux of the Reut Institute's analysis. They said that this attack from the delegitimizers, of course delegitimizers, you'll note, is a very derogatory word, but what they call delegitimization, I call working for peace, equality and justice. They say that this attack from the delegitimizers, and I quote, possesses strategic significance and may develop into a comprehensive existential threat within a few years. A harbinger of such a threat would be the collapse of the two-state solution as an agreed framework for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the coalescence behind a one-state solution as a new alternative framework. So they take this very seriously. Of course, they confuse cause and effect. They think that Israel's status has eroded because the peace and justice activists have been so brilliantly effective at disseminating their message. And I think they have, but I don't think they can claim all the credit. So they think Israel is losing legitimacy because there is a growing movement. But there is a growing movement because of Israel's actions. Israel is delegitimizing itself. There has been an upsurge in support for BDS since the attacks on Lebanon and Gaza in particular. They talk about undermining the two-state solution as if a little book I could write or a few conferences here or there could convince the multi-billion-dollar peace process industry to abandon its path. They don't mention that Israel has, since 1967, deliberately settled the West Bank in such a way as to make partition or repartition impossible. And today, there is really no prospect of removing the 500,000 settlers in the West Bank, at least not without what would likely be a very bloody war. And I should note that rather than suggest to the Israeli cabinet that Israel actually change its policies, the Reut Institute suggested they go on the attack and sabotage the delegitimizers. And I won't say more about that now, but it was particularly poor timing given they call on the intelligence agencies of Israel to focus on the hubs of delegitimization. This is the language they use. And the hubs they named were Madrid, London, Toronto, New York, and the San Francisco Bay Area. So they were issuing a report that the Israeli intelligence agencies should be engaging in sabotage against Americans, Canadians, and Europeans, engaging in constitutionally protected activities in their own countries. And they suggested this at just the time the Dubai assassination was exposed. So particularly poor timing. The other thing they suggested was better marketing for what they called brand Israel. The point I want to conclude with, a couple of points in closing, is that what was fundamental to bringing about the change in South Africa, and what is already demonstrably bringing about introspection in Israel, in the form at first of this sort of panic, but also we can actually see positive forms of introspection in Israel, is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. That this movement is imposing a cost on Israel. It is raising the price of the status quo, and therefore it is a strategy and a technology to help bring about the conditions where we could see real peace, just peace. The BDS movement is based on a call issued by hundreds of Palestinian civil society organizations in 2005, which calls on us in global civil society to boycott Israel academically and culturally, according to specific guidelines that I can refer you to that are online, and economically, until such a time that the three basic forms of Israeli oppression against Palestinians end. The denial of the right of return on racist grounds that Palestinians fail to be from the correct ethnic group, the forms of colonization and occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and an end to the apartheid faced by Palestinian citizens of Israel. Those are the three basic elements of any just outcome. And this call, as I said, is supported by the broad stream of Palestinian civil society. The other element, so the Economist talked about coercion to bring about a change among white South Africans. And BDS is a form of coercion, but it's a form of coercion that doesn't require a single Israeli child to skip a meal, that doesn't shed any blood, but nevertheless imposes a political, economic, and very importantly, moral cost on those who persist in injustice. But it's also not enough. I've argued, and what I've sought to do with my book and a little bit in my comments tonight, is to put forward a positive alternative. That we have to start engaging in the act of imagining the alternatives, I think in the form of a single state, and to engage in serious study of models that exist out there. And I talked a bit about Northern Ireland and South Africa as examples, but there may be others. It's possible to do this while taking into account the legitimate fears Israeli Jews have in the process of giving up power, but without indulging racism or maintaining undue privilege. And that's something that I would like to stress is your role and our role as well. That if you believe that a just outcome can happen, you can also help to bring it about through supporting the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions campaign in your communities. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to author and activist Ali Abunimah talking about the prospects for a just resolution to the conflict in Palestine-Israel, the debate over the one-state or two-state solutions, and the Boycott-Divestment-Sanctions campaign to bring an end to the illegal Israeli occupation in the West Bank and the blockade of Gaza. In a moment, we'll return to the question and answer session from the presentation. Ali Abunimah is co-founder of the Electronic Intifada, an online resource for news, commentary, analysis, and reference materials about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict from a Palestinian perspective. He is author of One Country, a bold proposal to end the Israeli-Palestinian impasse. To find out more about Ali Abunimah and his work, please visit the Electronic Intifada website at electronicintifada.net. And now we return to the question and answer session from the presentation. Ali Abunimah spoke at the First Unitarian Church in Portland, Oregon on March 5th, 2010. The first member of the audience with a question said that he had, in the past, asked about Palestinian unilateral declarations of an independent Palestinian state along the pre-1967 borders. This member of the audience said that he was told that such a declaration was tried years ago and that it was not successful. He said that he had also been told that Palestinians have not tried to declare an independent state, but that they should. Which answer is correct?
They did declare statehood in 1988, and they have contemplated doing so many times since. But declaring statehood is a meaningless act, because a state has to have control over its territory and borders and be able to protect its citizens and be able to define who its citizens are. And the Palestinian Authority has none of those attributes. It cannot control who lives on its territory. It doesn't control any territory. And it cannot defend or protect its people. So it would be an empty declaration. But I think the more important point is that statehood in and of itself doesn't change anything. It doesn't end the three forms of basic injustice Palestinians face. Well, it might end one of them. It might end the oppression of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, potentially. But it does nothing to address the apartheid conditions that Palestinian citizens live under in Israel, and does nothing to address the denial of the right of return on racist grounds. So statehood by itself is really not the answer. You really need to address the three basic injustices that affect all Palestinians together. And statehood is only a partial answer at best.
The next member of the audience suggested two other examples of states which might offer models for solutions to the Palestine-Israel conflict. The first is Belgium. On the other hand, there is the experience of Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia, which are not encouraging. This member of the audience also shared some observations about South Africa. The first observation is that Afrikaners in South Africa did not have the same status in South Africa that Jews have in the history of Western culture, so challenging the legitimacy of the Jewish state presents a different kind of political problem. The second observation concerning South Africa was that if we consider the idea of a right of return in the South African context, it would probably translate into some kind of land restitution, the return of land to the indigenous peoples of the region, and there's been very little of that since the end of apartheid in South Africa.
Okay, thank you. Three very good points. Belgium, I talk about Belgium in my book, so I'll simply refer you to that for the sake of brevity. But that's one potential model with pros and cons that, again, is worth looking at. In terms of, we should be very clear, the goal is not to target Jews or that Jews should be a pariah. Pariahs, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And we have to recognize that many Jews are active in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and even some Israelis have endorsed it. One of the things that has bothered the Israeli establishment most, if you read the Israeli newspapers, is that a number of Israeli academics and public figures have endorsed the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. So we have to be very clear that it's not a boycott of people because they're Israeli. It's a boycott of institutions and policies and those who support them. And any Israeli or any Jew can be part of the movement. And I routinely, when I speak to Israelis who are unconvinced, invite them to join the BDS movement. I think it's ultimately good for them as well. But it's true that there is a much stronger pro-Israel lobby than there ever was a pro-Afrikaner lobby. But there was significant support for the whites in South Africa around the world. In the 1950s, someone said Cheney, I think. Yes, and others. And there were business interests, so there was a lobby. And in the context of the Cold War, the South African regime was seen as an ally. So they were not without friends. But it took time for the anti-apartheid movement and the internal resistance to change those dynamics and make it politically unacceptable for for politicians to be silent. And you already see signs of that happening. Just a few weeks ago, 54 members of Congress signed a letter to Obama demanding that he force Israel to end the blockade. So we see those signs changing. Land reform, very quickly. You're right. South Africa, the end of apartheid didn't create a utopia in South Africa. Far from it. The process of decolonization is incomplete, and South Africa faces all the sorts of problems that every other country in Africa and indeed the world face. The only thing the end of political apartheid did really was give South Africans a chance to create a more just society through politics rather than violence, and they could still mess that up. So none of these things are very easy, and I think that's a lesson we see in our country as well, where the end of formal Jim Crow and the enactment of the Civil Rights Act still hasn't changed the basic economic realities and differences among racial groups in this country that have very long legacies and have yet, the fact that reparations is still a taboo topic in this country it really indicates to me how far we are from really addressing fully the history.
The next member of the audience observed that we hear many news reports about the fate of Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit, who was captured in an operation against the Israeli military, which routinely kills Palestinians in Gaza. We don't hear about the thousands of Palestinians who are rotting in Israeli prisons with no way out, with no prospects of due process. Thousands of Palestinian civilians imprisoned by Israel.
Yeah, thank you. I in fact usually refuse to use the name of the Israeli prisoner of war in Gaza because I think the fact that his name is so well known is in a sense a sign of really a racist valuation of life, that the names of thousands of Palestinian prisoners, including hundreds of children. Israel is routinely kidnapping children from the occupied territories. The other day, this was Amira Hassan, Haaretz, wrote an article about a particular case that is not untypical, of a 12-year-old boy who was arrested for trying to visit an aunt and who crossed over a Jewish-only road in the West Bank, because they have segregated roads, something they never had in apartheid South Africa. And he was brought before a military tribunal and he's in detention. He was brought before a military tribunal in shackles in the occupied West Bank, and this is routine. A friend of mine, Nora Barrows-Friedman, who is a brilliant young journalist with Flashpoint's radio and also the Electronic Intifada, is in Palestine now. And she's reporting on a case of two brothers, one aged 12 and one aged 10, who were arrested by the Israeli authorities and who are being, put on trial, and one of them was actually just beaten up, kidnapped and beaten up and left by the soldiers. We don't hear about any of that. So that shows the differential valuation of life, and I think we have to change that. We have to rehumanize Palestinian people and Lebanese people who can be killed by the hundreds and who are never given even a name.
The next member of the audience commented on the cases of South Africa and Ireland. He said that there were two important points that have not been mentioned. In both cases, the resistance movements, the African National Congress in South Africa and the IRA in Northern Ireland, were in full swing at the time, militantly forcing the issue of freedom for the colonized peoples onto the table. And the second point is that in both cases the United States was determined to have both conflicts settled. In the case of South Africa, the United States imposed sanctions and closed banks and other financial institutions until the white settlers were forced to accept equal rights for the black South Africans. In the case of Palestine, the Palestinian Authority president has basically given up the struggle. He refuses to talk with Hamas. He speaks of Hamas as if they were the settler and colonialists themselves. Where's the resistance in this case? Where's the United States in this conflict? The U.S. every day becomes more radical in its support for Israeli moves to colonize whatever is left in the West Bank and Jerusalem, and continues to support the blockade of Gaza. In such a situation, what could possibly persuade the Israeli settlers and colonists to turn on a dime, reach out to their Palestinian brothers and sisters and say, "Come, let's all live together as equals in one state"?
I don't think that you're going to make them do that very easily. I think the point is that people in power resist giving up power, and Israelis show themselves to be quite typical and quite ruthless in doing that. You have to remember that the demands for civil rights in this country and the end to apartheid were not met with roses and sweets. They were met with dogs and fire hoses and bombs and lynchings. That's how this country greeted the demand for equal rights. So this country resisted, and in some ways still resists, fiercely equal rights for all its citizens. So you have to have resistance. Resistance is important. People have a right to resist, but you have to ask what forms of resistance will be effective and which ones will be used. Nelson Mandela refused to give up the right to armed struggle until, and he never gave up the right to armed struggle. Many people see violence as a dead end and wish for an alternative. Well, that's fine. But simply saying, if condemnation of violence was sufficient, then we wouldn't have any violence, because everyone condemns violence. The Pope does it several times a year. He prays for peace in the Holy Land and appeals to people not to use violence, as does every other religious leader. And so we have no shortage of pleas. I think the answer is not to lecture people or condemn, but to provide an alternative. And I believe the alternative is BDS. That if there is a growing, strong BDS movement, that Palestinians feel the strength of international solidarity, that they will have a strong alternative to violence, and yet maintain their resistance. And I think the resistance of Palestinians is what we call sumud, steadfastness, that the people in Gaza, regardless of what's been done to them, have refused to submit, have refused to live on their knees. This is very powerful. Think of this. Benjamin Netanyahu has demanded that as a condition for peace, Palestinians recognize Israel's so-called right to exist as a Jewish state. It's like asking, like Afrikaners asking for their right to have a white minority state. What does that mean? It means that Netanyahu understands that the Palestinians have the power to give or withhold consent from the Zionist project. He's recognizing their power. And so far they've said no, not on these terms. So I don't think all the support of the United States can overcome that. And as I said at the beginning, the US administration will carry on. But I think we're reaching a critical mass where even in this country there is a movement that is starting to create a safe space for members of Congress who don't want to vote yes for every AIPAC resolution, who the first time they might vote present, the second time they might abstain, the third time they might vote no. But what creates that space is the growing movement.
The next member of the audience acknowledged that the government of Israel has been jeopardizing the security of its citizens by building illegal settlements, by repression against the Palestinians, and the ongoing occupation. She said, however, that she was curious about what the speaker thought of Hamas supporters and the people of Gaza. How responsible are they for the ongoing conflict? How hopeful is the speaker for a resolution to this conflict? And what can people involved in this conflict be doing differently to bring about some progress towards a just peace?
That's a good question. I think you have to begin by recognizing the radical imbalance of power, and that Palestinians are not without agency, they're not powerless. And I think that their steadfastness in the face of unbelievable suffering, I mean, just some of the staggering statistics of what has happened in Gaza that are not widely known in this country attest to what's gone on. So, for example, of the 640 schools in Gaza, 18 were completely destroyed in the Israeli bombing and 280 damaged. And since then, Israel has not allowed any reconstruction supplies into Gaza, and hasn't allowed textbooks into Gaza. And yet every day hundreds of thousands of children show up to damaged schools without windows or with boarded up windows to learn. And their parents still push them to learn and value education above almost anything else. This is a form of resistance. I mean, that should be recognized as part of resistance, right? So these are the ways that Palestinians are steadfast. The farmers whose land is in the free fire zones, which Israel has declared around the borders of Gaza, go into their fields despite the fact that farmers are shot and injured and shot and killed by Israeli soldiers on a daily basis. They're determined to farm their land. So this is another form of resistance, farming the land despite the violence of the Israeli state. Some people blame Palestinians for firing rockets into Israel. And they say, well, that undermines their cause. And you could make that argument. Judge Richard Goldstone says that firing the rockets at Israeli towns is a war crime. I think that people look for alternatives. I don't think any Palestinian parent ever wanted their child to become a fighter or to die. I don't think there is a single Palestinian parent who would prefer their child to be a fighter instead of an engineer or a doctor. So I think the challenge is to provide alternatives, to give people the solidarity that they need so that the other forms of resistance can predominate. And I think that's the challenge for us. So no, Palestinians are not powerless, but you have to recognize how limited their ability to change their situation is by themselves. They need tremendous solidarity and support to do so.
The next member of the audience observed that Egypt constantly aids and abets Israel by stifling the Palestinian people. In the larger context, the surrounding Arab nations seem indifferent to the Palestinians' plight. In particular, Iran could do far more to assist the Palestinians, and it could do so for no other reason than to confront U.S. policy in the region. Have the Palestinian people indeed been abandoned by the larger Arab world, and in particular by Iran?
Thank you. That's a good question. I think that the situation in the surrounding Arab world is related to the situation in Palestine, because while the United States supports Israel, indeed sponsors Israel, it also supports and sponsors the surrounding Arab puppet regimes who act without the consent and legitimacy of their people. You see among Arab public opinion a tremendous support for the Palestinian people, but very few avenues for people to provide practical support and resistance with these regimes in place. We see in Egypt, when I was in Egypt for the Gaza Freedom March, we felt tremendous solidarity from the Egyptian people. But they also live under a regime that doesn't respect their rights and their dignity. But in Egypt, we're beginning to see a fraying where people are starting to speak out against the regime in ways that were unimaginable just a couple of years ago. People fear that after Mubarak goes, they may try to install his son, as is happening in Libya, by the way, with U.S. support, has happened in a number of other countries where you have these sort of dynastic republics. So this is a regional situation that stretches all the way to Afghanistan and Pakistan, where you have a combination of U.S. occupation and puppet regimes. And it's generating all sorts of resistance. I think we're making the mistake again. Whatever people think about the Taliban, it seems to be an obvious point that most of their support is generated by nationalist resistance rather than adherence to a specific ideology. We made the same mistake in Vietnam, where we said the people are fighting because they're communists and we have to defeat the communists. And what the anti-war movement was saying is, communist or not, this is primarily anti-colonial resistance. And so the U.S. is fighting unwinnable wars and supporting illegitimate regimes over an ever-expanding part of the globe. And this is why I think it's very important to make the connection between Iraq, Afghanistan, and Palestine and Pakistan, because we see the same model of puppet regimes, proxy armies funded and trained by the United States, fighting against local resistance, and neoliberal economics imposed on these countries. And it's the same model everywhere, and it's absolutely a disaster for all the people of the region. So I'm not sure if that was exactly your question, but I wanted to take the opportunity to draw the connections. So really, I mean, I think it's unavoidable to really point to the continued insistence of the United States to dominate and control a large swath of the world, which is, I didn't mention Yemen and Somalia, where we have the same model coming into place as well. So U.S. imperialism remains a fundamental issue, and I think needs to be identified as such.
The next member of the audience asked the speaker what he would say to Israelis to convince them that the one-state solution will follow the South African model rather than end up in a bloodbath. What makes the speaker so sure that attempts to remove the settlers from the settlements in the West Bank will not result in a bloodbath?
That's a good question. There's no guarantee. Nobody has a crystal ball. But I think that the sooner you start to create the conditions of justice, the better the chances of a successful outcome are. Why do I think? I think an attempt to create a two-state solution would lead to a bloodbath for a number of reasons, but one main one. The basic premise or the reason for why all of a sudden, remember, 20 years ago, it was taboo to support a Palestinian state in this country. If you supported a Palestinian state, you were accused of being anti-Israeli. Now, if you don't support a Palestinian state, you're accused. Why is that? Because they see a Palestinian state or Bantustan as the only way to legitimize Israel as a so-called Jewish state, to carve out a political space with a Jewish majority. And that's why Israel did what it did to Gaza. It was in order to remove the Palestinians in Gaza from consideration. I mean, the Palestinians in Gaza are 1.5 million people with no citizenship and no state. In a world of states, they exist in a non-state. We don't know what it is. It's a totally unique entity. And but it's a way for Israel to wash its hands of them, to say these unwanted people are not our problem, we subtract them from the population and we maintain the Jewish majority. So if tomorrow we woke up and we found that during the night Israel had dismantled all the settlements and taken out all the settlers, and there were a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, what would be the result? The peace process industry dogma says we would have two states living side by side in peace. I think we would have something completely different. The Israeli Jewish population would say, we made this tremendous sacrifice, and what did we end up with? We didn't end up with a Jewish state, we ended up with half a state. We still have 1.5 million Palestinians living among us, and they're demanding equal rights. To hell with them, get them out of here. And I think that the next phase would be the expulsion, ethnic cleansing of Palestinian citizens of Israel. That would be the most likely result of an attempt to repartition Palestine. And especially if settlers had to be expelled from their settlements in the West Bank. They would take revenge on the Palestinian communities, and that's what would create a Bosnia or Yugoslavia situation. The ethnic cleansing in Palestine, in Yugoslavia, was a result of secessions and a result of partitions. That when somebody declares this space is now mine, you try to seize territory and get rid of the enemy population. So I think that an attempt to repartition Palestine is what would lead to Bosnia or Yugoslavia. And incidentally, this is the reason why repartition was never considered for Northern Ireland. There was at a certain point ideas that said, well, the original partition line that the British drew in 1921 was the wrong line. There were too many Catholics on the Protestant side of the line, so let's redraw the line to create a more homogeneous territories, so that there would be a smaller Northern Ireland, but it would have a much larger Protestant majority. And these plans were universally rejected because of the prediction that any attempt to repartition Northern Ireland would most likely lead to ethnic cleansing, for exactly the same reasons. So, in reality, you cannot create, we have this idea that you can have a neat Palestinian state and a Jewish state. The reality is that Jews live now throughout historic Palestine, and Palestinians live throughout historic Palestine. To partition them would require tremendous violence and, I think, entail enormous risks. Look at what happened in India and Pakistan. Nobody predicted that. That was the amazing thing. The opponents of partition in India and the supporters, the opponents didn't predict that 12 million people would be displaced and 1 million killed in the partition in 1947. And in Ireland, nobody predicted that the partition would lead to another 70-odd years of conflict. So partitions don't have a very good history, and they tend to produce ethnic cleansing rather than produce solutions.
The next member of the audience asked what it would take for the Security Council of the United Nations to assume the role of impartial arbiter in enforcing either a one-state settlement or a two-state settlement, and apply international peacekeepers to this purpose.
Would take a magic wand. I think that the current framework, the UN institutions, there are some good UN institutions, but the basic setup of the Security Council reflects a colonial world where some countries are more equal than others and get to make the law for everyone else. And I don't think that's what people envisioned the United Nations becoming. So I think it needs a root and branch reform, which is impossible to do, it seems, because the countries who control it don't want that. So it's hard to see the Security Council assuming the role it's supposed to have in its charter of acting to guarantee international peace and security, sadly.
The next member of the audience observed that one thing that Israeli society and Palestinian society have in common is workers, a working class that has a shared interest in a one-state solution to this conflict. The common interests of Palestinian and Israeli workers are not often discussed. This member of the audience suggested that what is needed is a one-state socialist solution.
Well, that would be nice, but you can't have socialism in just one country, can you?
The next member of the audience described the difficult struggle that took place in Oregon to educate the broader public about the apartheid regime in South Africa. Oregon was the only American state to have ties with South African sports teams in the early 80s, in defiance of the international boycott of South Africa. Local activists worked for 8 years to break those ties, and the local daily paper, The Oregonian, never once ran an editorial in support of the international sports boycott against South Africa. Local activists worked for 10 years to force the Oregon legislature to divest public funds from corporations that supported the South African regime. The Oregonian also never ran an editorial in support of the divestment movement. The Oregon Investment Council insisted that it would not be prudent to withdraw money from corporations doing business in South Africa. It was a long and very difficult struggle to make significant progress in the South Africa boycott and sanctions movement.
Yeah. Yes. Well, let me just say that that those lessons, I think, need to be passed on, particularly to the younger generation who are spearheading this struggle. And I think one of the things they can do is to go to those institutions and say, you made the wrong decisions back then, and this is your chance to do it right. May I suggest that those people who are standing could could give their questions, and why don't we take all three of them in a row, and then I'll close with the final answer for each of them.
The next member of the audience asked the speaker to talk about the influence of the Israeli lobby on U.S. policy towards the conflict.
Yeah, okay. I can just answer that quite briefly because I'm afraid I will forget if I wait till the end. The Israeli lobby is quite influential. I think that, though, the right answer, what we can do is to build the alternative, the BDS movement. I strongly believe that. I don't think we can or should try to replicate the influence of the pro-Israel lobby because that is not a democratic movement. I think we need to focus on a grassroots and democratic approach to this struggle. The gentleman didn't wait for the answer, but that's, yeah.
The next member of the audience asked the speaker what he envisioned as the governmental structure for a single unitary state in Palestine-Israel.
I think this is not the moment to tie oneself to a specific model. I think it's the time to study existing models and possibilities, and I mentioned the two analogous examples we have to learn from. Contemporary examples are South Africa and Northern Ireland. Someone mentioned Belgium, and I talked about that in my book. And there may be others. But the point is, I think a very important point is that it's not sufficient to deal with this as a constitutional matter of how you define the Constitution. It requires change at very fundamental levels, what Omar Barghouti calls ethical decolonization. You have to dismantle the structures of domination and dominated, and that has to happen at the level of housing, education, land reform, economic opportunity, and that's very difficult. And what has tended to happen is that some of those things get delayed. People deal with the constitutional issues and they relegate the economic and social justice issues down the road. I think one of the lessons we can learn is that those things have to be dealt with up front, as difficult as they are. So that's, I think, as fundamental as the constitutional issues. There are all sorts of possibilities for constitutional arrangements. I don't think it would be particularly hard to find one once you get Israeli Jews to the point where they're ready to make this quantum leap. And that's the importance of building the pressure on them.
The next member of the audience observed that Israel identifies itself as an ethnic democracy, as a Jewish state. This member of the audience believes that a lot of the ethnic and Jewish identity is perpetrated by the chief rabbinate, the rabbis that run the country, which is resented by many Israelis themselves, who resent the laws restricting marriages or regulating business practice, and also the high levels of corruption that have been documented to exist in the rabbinate. How well do you think these sorts of issues might fit in with the BDS campaign?
Well, I think we have to be clear. I think that Israel is a settler colonial state with Jewish flavoring, but I don't think there's anything fundamentally Jewish about it. And it's like, I mean, there are differences, but it fits the general pattern of settler colonial states. Remember that in South Africa, the Dutch Reformed Church was a leading voice providing ideological and biblical foundations for apartheid. In this country, the Bible was used to justify slavery and Jim Crow. So these sorts of colonial practices they always find some kind of ideological framework to try to legitimize it. So the kinds of policies you mentioned, for example, the ban on civil marriage, the law which effectively prevents Israeli citizens from marrying Palestinians because they're not allowed to live together in Israel if they marry Palestinians, are very similar to the kind of Jim Crow laws that were in this country and which were not, which were inspired by racism and colonial privilege rather than anything else. So I think that colonialism is still the best framework through which to understand Israel's policies and to identify and target them with BDS. Thank you very much for your patience and attention.
You've been listening to author and activist Ali Abunimah talking about the prospects for a just resolution to the conflict in Israel-Palestine, the debate over a one-state or two-state solution, and the Boycott-Divestment-Sanctions campaign to bring an end to the illegal Israeli occupation in the West Bank and the blockade of Gaza. Ali Abunimah is author of One Country, a bold proposal to end the Israeli-Palestinian impasse. To find out more about Ali Abunimah and his work, please visit the Electronic Intifada website at electronicintifada.net. This program was produced by PDX Justice Media Productions of Portland, Oregon. To find out more about our work and to access our growing library of free on-demand streaming video and audio programs, please visit our website at pdxjustice.org. And write to us with your questions and comments at pdxjustice@riseup.net. We'd love to hear from you. Many of our programs are available on DVD. Please write to us for ordering information. Thanks for tuning in, and thanks for supporting listener-sponsored radio, public access cable television, net neutrality, independent bookstores, and all forms of grassroots, democratic community media.